Welcome to this series on the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, which we've titled One Story, Five Perspectives. In fact, we're going to see a lot more than five perspectives. We're going to see dozens of different ideas and interpretations and approaches to this fascinating, troubling story in Genesis 22. My name is Aaron Kohler. I'm a professor of Biblical and Near Eastern Studies at Yeshiva University. I had the privilege of writing a book about the Akedah a number of years ago called Unbinding Isaac. And we will have a chance to talk a little bit about why I think unbinding Isaac is such an important theme, especially in today's religious and ethical environment. But we're going to approach the story from a number of different perspectives. Before we start approaching the story, we need to just know what the story is. So let's start with the story itself. We're going to be talking about one story. It's actually only 19 verses in Genesis 22. It's a story that's told often, not in the Bible, but after the Bible, and is told very differently by different people at different times. Many stories travel and morph as they do. Some stories, not too many, touch on themes that are so profound, so raw, and so universal that they are picked up but immediately understood differently in different cultures. The themes may remain the same, but the details will change. And in fact, often even the ancillary themes will be changed. So the story that we're talking about is in the Hebrew Bible in Genesis 22. It's alluded to in the Christian Bible in the New Testament, and it's also told in the Quran in one of the chapters there. So we will see all of those things in the coming weeks. We're also going to see how many interpreters have responded to it. Now, in all versions of the story, God appears to Abraham and tells Abraham to offer his son as a sacrifice. So let's get into the story, and then we'll be able to take this a little bit in more detail. The story begins, Vayhi achar hadivarim ha'eleh. Sometime afterwards, literally it was after these things, God tested Abraham. And we're going to talk about what these things are that it was after, and what does it mean for God to test Abraham. He said, Abraham, and Abraham answered, Hineni, here I am, which is a word we will come back to as well. And God says, take your son, your favorite one, or the one you love, your only one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. Offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will point out to you. Now, Abraham at that point seems to live in Be'er Sheva, down in the Negev desert. And so according to Google Maps, it would take about 19 and a half hours of walking to get from Be'er Sheva to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Now, notice that the Bible never said it was a Temple Mount. The Bible said it was one of the mountains of the land of Moriah. Not actually clear where that may be, and some people have suggested that it's not in Jerusalem, but Jewish tradition has always had it from already in biblical times, actually, that the mountain of the binding, the mountain of the Akedah, is the mountain on which Solomon later built the temple. Abraham woke up in the morning, saddled his donkey, took two servants and his son Isaac, split the wood, and set out. On the third day, which makes sense, because if it's a 19 and a half hour walk, 3 days of walking, and he gets to the region, and he saw the place from afar. Abraham said, stay here to the servants, the boy and I will go up, we will worship, we will return to you. And now in verses 6 through 8, we get the only conversation in the entire story between Abraham and Isaac. So Abraham takes the wood, puts it on Isaac, which again, a detail that we will see resonated with some readers. And he himself took the fire and the knife, and they walked together. Isaac turns to his father Abraham. Now, we should notice, we've never been told in the story how old Isaac is. In the previous chapter, he was born. In the next chapter, he'll be 37. So he could be anywhere from 0 to 37. And the only clues we have are sort of internal clues. So pay careful attention to his character as we try to think about what kind of person this is. Isaac says, Father, Avi. And Abraham said, yes, my son. In fact, that's the same word that Abraham used to answer God, Hineni. And Isaac said, well, here's the fire and here's the wood, but where's the sheep for the sacrifice? And Abraham said, God will see to the sheep for his burnt offering, my son. And the two of them walked together. Exactly the same three Hebrew words that we had at the end of verse 6. They came to the place at which God told him. Abraham built an altar there. He laid out the wood. He bound his son Isaac. He laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham picked up the knife to slay his son. Now, this is the point of the story that many artists have chosen to depict. Isaac is bound on the altar, the knife's in Abraham's hand, and it's clearly a moment of great tension. As readers of the Bible, we often suffer from the problem of knowing too much. We're unfortunately omniscient readers. We know how the stories are going to end, and so it's hard for us sometimes to actually feel the tension in the stories. An artist freezes the scene for us. This is an arresting picture by Caravaggio that we'll come back to in a moment. This one's hanging in the Uffizi. Caravaggio actually painted the scene a couple of times. But Caravaggio, among other artists, froze the scene at exactly this moment. Abraham has the knife. Isaac is not only bound, but clearly in agony, in pain, in terror. And in this picture, he's also looking at us, which is a point that I think is very important. Now, narratively, the story slowed down at this point as well. So it's not only Caravaggio's perspective that this is the moment at which we should be pausing. If we think about the narrative, we ran through 3 days of travel in one verse. They walked 3 days. On the third day, they saw the site. There's a conversation, and then 2 verses depict step after step the action of building the altar, putting on the wood, arranging the wood, binding Isaac, putting him on the wood, on top of the wood, we're told again, picking up the knife to slaughter his son. And again, clearly time has slowed down here. If we don't feel the tension, that's because we're rushing through to the end. We need to be reading carefully and feel the anxiety that the characters feel the tension in the air as we get to this point. And we will come back to the question of what exactly is the tension? Is it just about the life of Isaac, or is there something else going on here? But that is the tense moment in the story. Now, I mentioned that Caravaggio did something interesting with Isaac here. He has Isaac looking directly at us. So Isaac's right eyes are fixed on the viewer, as you can see in this close-up image. And that, I think, is also ethically important. Caravaggio is saying, look, we need to have our attention fixed on Isaac right now. There's a lot going on. There's history, there's covenant, there's the drama of Abraham's relationship with God. But first and foremost, there's a life on the line, and Isaac is bound on the altar and looking at us. And I think the only response that we can have is to look back at him. So that's something that we need to think about ethically as we read the story, is to make sure that our attention never diverges from Isaac and what's at stake for him. Now we can pick up the story again as we pause and absorb the tension. An angel calls to Abraham from heaven, Abraham, Abraham, and he answers for the third time, Hineni, here I am. And the angel says, Al tishlach et chal hanar, don't raise your hand against the boy, or don't do anything to him, because now I know that you fear God. You have not withheld your son, your only one, from me. Abraham looked up, and he saw a ram caught in the thicket by its horn. So he went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in place of his son. And Abraham named the site Adonai Yireh. And then the text breaks out of the story and comments, which is why today people say, on the mountain of God, on the mountain of the Lord, he will be seen, or there will be seen. As we said, a number of artists chose to depict the moment before or the moment of Isaac's being saved by the angel. So Caravaggio in his painting, if we zoom out now, and see the left scene, which I didn't show you a moment ago, Abraham's actually not just looking off to the right, he's looking at the angel who's there. Now, interestingly, in Caravaggio's painting, the angel is pointing to the ram, which is not the case in the biblical story. In the biblical story, no one told Abraham to offer the ram in place of Isaac. Abraham seems to have just felt that I've come all this way, I can't go without offering a sacrifice. And so he sees a ram and offers it. That angel, of course, has immense power in the story narratively, and also the question of why an angel? God is the one who commanded Abraham to offer the sacrifice. Why is it an angel who commands Abraham not to? Is there some theological or thematic significance to that change? One of my favorite paintings of this is Titian's, which you see in front of you now, the 16th century painter. And Titian has a remarkable perspective on it. He has us sort of lying on the ground looking up, and we see Abraham from below, and we see Isaac. And note that in Titian's depiction, Isaac is a much younger child than Caravaggio has. I mean, he's not a young adult or an adolescent as Caravaggio has, but really a child. And that certainly does something to us emotionally. Titian's Isaac is also not particularly in anguish, it seems. One artist who chose to depict the next moment is Jan Levens, a friend and colleague of Rembrandt's, the 17th century, up in the Netherlands. And Levens really fascinatingly decided to have Abraham and Isaac embracing. This is clearly the moment after the angel has intervened, because the knife is on the ground, and Abraham and Isaac are together looking up at presumably the source of the voice that just saved Isaac's life. We're going to talk more about the Abraham and Isaac being together or not together after the Akedah in a bit. But I think Levens' choice to depict the next moment is quite a powerful one. Now, just to wrap up the story, and then we'll reflect on it a bit more, the angel then calls to Abraham a second time, and he says, speaking in the name of God, "By myself I swear," says God. That is a powerful point. God has never sworn by God's self before. The theologian David Blumenthal has made a big deal about this in reading the Akedah, that this is the first time that God has actually taken an oath by God, as anyone would, as to the following promise. "Because you have done this and not withheld your son, your only one, I will bestow my blessings upon you. Make your descendants as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sands on the seashore." And then Abraham, in the last verse, returned to his servants. Abraham returned to his servants, and they departed together for Beersheba, and Abraham dwelled in Beersheba. And of course, we note, as readers have noted forever, that Isaac has dropped out of the story. And that's another point that we'll have to return to. Whereas Abraham and Isaac walked together twice, back in verses 6 and 8. Here, Abraham walks together with his servants, but Isaac's not even mentioned. Now, the literary critic Erich Auerbach, German-Jewish literary critic who fled to Turkey during World War II, and actually there wrote this great book, Mimesis, on, as you can see the subtitle, The Representation of Reality in Western Literature. In his first chapter, he contrasts the story of the binding of Isaac with the way that Homer tells stories. And Auerbach points out that our narrative that we just read the entire story, is very spare. We hear nothing of the landscape that they walked through, the people that they met along the way, where they slept, what they ate, what do they wear, or even what they talked about, except for that one brief exchange where Isaac asks for the sheep and Abraham seems to evade the question. Auerbach says that the story is fraught with background, that the spare storytelling makes us wonder about everything that's behind the stage. I read it a bit differently. I don't think it's fraught with background, but it simply has no background. And this is not so abnormal or unusual in biblical storytelling. Now, if we think about other stories, other great stories, Homer's Iliad is about the anger of Achilles and the passion of Paris, but those characters play their parts on the canvas of this momentous war between the Greeks and the Trojans. So part of what gives us power is the focus on the individuals in the midst of this big swirling battle. Hamilton, to take a more recent example, is the story of a remarkable, complex person and all of his interesting and tumultuous relationships, but again, in the context of an epoch-altering revolution, a world turned upside down. These stories are great human dramas, and they take place within world-altering events. Now, some stories in the Bible are of this sort. The life of Moses is the Exodus and the birth of the nation. The biography of David is also the rise of the monarchy in Israel. But not so Abraham. Abraham, there's no background here. When did the story take place? Nothing's said. What towns did he pass by? Where is the land of Moriah? We're not told any of these things. Did anyone think about him? Did anyone notice him? Was there a war raging around? Who controlled the territory? These are just topics that are not broached in the story. In Hamilton, as you might recall, after a couple of songs about the Hamilton's personal life and the death of Philip, Jefferson says, can we get back to politics? Because the birth of the country is easier to look at than the suffering of an individual. Right? It actually is emotionally taxing, draining, exhausting, and painful to stare at someone in emotional turmoil for too long. In the Akedah, there is nowhere to look but at Abraham and Isaac climbing a mountain with a knife in their hand. Now, 3 times in the story, Abraham says, Hineni, I am here, to God when he's first commanded. Hineni to Isaac when the son has a question, and Hineni when the angel calls out from heaven. Abraham is constantly here. He's constantly in front of us, and there's nothing behind him. Caravaggio's Eye of Isaac staring at us, I think, is emotionally actually exhausting and painful. But that's what the Bible wants to do to us. We have to look carefully at such an austere character. It is difficult. We actually wish for more background, but the biblical narrative just doesn't provide it. Now, there's a lot we're going to try to do over the next 3.5 classes. And the 5th class, we will be live together, analyzing in particular one recent thinker, poet, prophet on the story of the Akedah. But today we'll try to do 2 specific questions. The first one is, what does it mean after these things? And I want to look at 3 approaches to this, that each of which I think has philosophical or theological significance. In other words, by interpreting the words after these things in different ways, these readers, these interpreters are coloring the whole story in an interesting and important way. So we're going to start with an ancient tradition. It's found in the Targum. The Targum is the Aramaic translation of the Bible. And in ancient times in the land of Israel and Byzantine Palestine, the Targum was read out loud in the synagogue, and it was actually performed. So on a regular Shabbat morning, you would have one person reading the Torah, and then after every verse, they would pause, and someone else would render it into Aramaic. Now, I should say that the Torah readings in Byzantine Palestine were a lot shorter than the ones that are familiar to us for today. We've inherited the Babylonian tradition, but in fact, for example, Genesis 22, the story of the Akedah, was a reading unto itself. So one Shabbat morning, you'd walk into the synagogue, and they would read Genesis 22. The Aramaic rendering was not made up on the spot by the translator, but was instead, there were traditional renderings, and the translator could play with that. Within these renderings, there were also some interpretations, some midrashic elements. And we find one of those at the very beginning of our chapter. So in the Targum, in the Aramaic translation, we have the following. This is a Targum that's called Targum Jonathan. That has nothing to do with anyone named Jonathan, but we find the following. It was after these words, so that's just a straight translation of the Hebrew. And then the Targum explains, after Isaac and Ishmael were arguing. Now, Ishmael, of course, you remember, was Abraham's firstborn son, but born not to Sarah, but to his maidservant Hagar. And in Genesis 21, a passage we will come back to, Ishmael and his mother Hagar were actually banished from Abraham's household after the birth of Isaac. But in this story, the two of them were arguing. Ishmael said, I should inherit father. It's appropriate for me to be father's heir, for I am his firstborn son. Isaac said, age is not what matters, rank is what matters. It would be appropriate for me to be father's heir, for I am the son of Sarah, his wife. You are the son of Hagar, my mother's maidservant. So at this point, it's a standoff. Ishmael has age on his side. Isaac has status on his side. Ishmael says, you know what? Let's put birth aside. Who's earned it? Ishmael answered, I am more worthy than you, since I was circumcised when I was 13 years old. And had I wanted to object, I didn't have to allow myself to be circumcised. But you were circumcised when you were 8 days old. Had you had any sense, you might not have allowed yourself to be circumcised at all. Which is a very good point. Isaac has never earned anything. He's done nothing on his own to earn any credit. And Isaac answered, well, now I am 36 years old. And if God asked for all of my limbs, I would not object. Now, immediately, these words were heard by the master of the world. And immediately the word of God tested Abraham and said, Abraham. And he said, here I am. Now, in this text, in this rendering of it, the test, the trial, is not really of Abraham at all. It's actually of Isaac. Isaac is the one who needs to earn credit. Abraham's earned plenty of credit already. We've been watching him since Genesis 12. He's had 10 chapters of doing nothing but earning credit in the divine court. But Isaac, who was born in Genesis 21, has done nothing. Is he worthy of being the heir to Abraham? We actually have no idea. And I think this passage, this Targum, this Midrash, is astutely pointing out that were it not for the Akedah, we could legitimately wonder whether Isaac is worthy of taking over Abraham's mantle. It's very interesting that the way of proving one's worthiness here is being willing to die for the faith. That's something that we don't have in the Bible. No one dies for faith in the Bible. There's literally one story in the book of Daniel of being willing to die for faith, but the people there are saved. In the Bible, there is no martyrdom. But by the time we get to the Midrash, by the time we get to this text, martyrdom is unfortunately a known phenomenon in Jewish history. And maybe more importantly, it's a known phenomenon in Christian history. And when I say more important, it's because the text here seems to be suggesting that if we assume, and I think it's a fair assumption, that Isaac stands in here for Jews, then Jews actually look at their neighbors and say, well, maybe I haven't actually sacrificed myself for God, but I'd be willing to sacrifice myself for God. And the Akedah is the proof of that. What do I have in mind? I have in mind that in early Roman times, early Roman centuries in the land of Israel, the 1st century, the 2nd century CE, through the 3rd century, in fact, Christianity was an illegal religion, and Christians had many, many martyrs that they talked about. Unfortunately, for the martyrs involved, there are dozens of stories of martyrdoms of men and women in early Christian literature who could have saved themselves by simply repudiating their belief in Jesus, but refused to, and went to their deaths for their faith. Now, Judaism was not an illegal religion. We do, unfortunately, have a handful of stories of martyrs, Rabbi Akiva being the most famous one, but it's really only a handful. And this is generally in response to particular historical events like the Jews rebelling against the Romans. Generally speaking, the Jews were better off than the Christians under the Romans and didn't suffer for their faith in the same way. And you can imagine a Jew and a Christian discussing this, and the Jew actually feeling inferior, paradoxically, for not dying. There is something powerful about martyrdom. We know that there is, intuitively, even though we might recoil from wanting to look at it head on. But there is an argument to make that goes something like this. For things that are really important, people are willing to die. Therefore, if people are dying for X, X must be really important. Now, if more people are dying for Christianity than for Judaism, does that suggest that Christianity is more important than Judaism? Maybe even, chas v'shalom, more true? And I think that's the background to the conversation we're reading here. And Isaac says to Ishmael, look, I know you've done more. I know you've, in fact, sacrificed more than I have, but that's just a matter of circumstance. God's never asked me to sacrifice myself. If God asked me to sacrifice myself, I would be, of course, willing to do it immediately. And then the word of God comes to Abraham and says, Abraham. And Abraham says, here I am. And so off we are to the Akedah as a way of proving Isaac's, and by extension the Jews' willingness to die for their faith. There's a lot going on here, but I think one of the interesting things literarily is simply the fact that the story has been recast as a story of the trial of Isaac rather than the trial of Abraham. Abraham is here just as the person who's needed in order to raise the knife to Isaac's neck. But really the point is to prove that Isaac is worthy of being Abraham's heir by showing that he's willing to engage in self-sacrifice. So that's one approach. Different approach, interesting and troubling in a different way, is the approach found in the commentary of Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir. This is a grandson of Rashi, the great 11th century commentator on the Torah. Rashi, as I think is well known, had 3 daughters. One of them, the oldest one, had a child named Shmuel, and it's his commentary that we're looking at right now. And so his abbreviation, Shmuel ben Meir, Rashbam. Rashbam has a couple of really distinctive features of his commentary. One is that he rejects interpreting the text on the basis of Midrash at all. So the Midrash is interesting and even important in and of itself, but we have to read the text on its own terms. And so in our case, what that means is, it says after these things, that means I have to read it as immediately after what happened right before in Genesis 21. Now, what did happen in Genesis 21? Well, there's actually a few scenes in Genesis 21, but the last one, after the birth of Isaac and the banishment of Ishmael, is that Abraham makes a covenant with a king named Avimelech, the king of a territory called Gerar, which seems to be in the Negev also, like right near Beersheba. And Avimelech sees that Abraham now has an heir, has a dynasty, and says, it's probably good for us to make a treaty so that we won't bother each other, we won't steal wells and harass each other's flocks and water rights and so on. And so they make a covenant. And Rashbam says, right after Abraham made a pact obligating himself, his children, his grandchildren, God became angry about this, since the land of the Philistines he had given him and his descendants. So Rashbam really fascinatingly says, and this is going to be hard to say without sounding political, but I don't mean this politically. Rashbam says, Abraham's willingness to sign away land rights in the land of Israel angered God. Because God had said, walk around the land, its length and breadth, and I will give it to you. And Abraham then turns around and says, well, now that I have a child, Avimelech, why don't we make a deal? You have some of the rights to the land, I'll have some of the rights to the land, we'll share. And according to Rashbam, God was really angry at that. And he paraphrases as follows: God nisat Abraham. Rashbam argues that nisat doesn't actually mean tested. It means provoked him and caused him pain. In other words, God said to Abraham, you took pride in the son that I granted you, making a pact between yourselves and their children. Now go offer him as a burnt offering. Let it be seen what good your making a pact accomplished. So there's the land issue here. That's one interesting issue. That according to Rashbam, God was really angry that Abraham had signed off on sharing the land. But there's also a deeper issue here, which is that God sees, and this is echoed in a number of different ways in a number of readings, God sees that Abraham now has a child, and God wonders whether actually Abraham's relationship with God has been merely utilitarian up to this point. If we remember back to Genesis 12, remember that God's introduction to Abraham was, go or come to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great people. Now, Abraham at that point is 75 years old. Abraham is childless. Abraham follows God, but does Abraham follow God because Abraham has faith in God? Or does Abraham follow God because Abraham figured, look, I have no idea what this thing is going on, what's going on here. I don't know what this God is. I don't know anything about this. All I know is I thought that there was no way I would ever have children. And here's a God telling me that I may yet have offspring. And I don't know if it's true or not. I don't know if it's legitimate or not, but you know what? That's a chance I'm willing to take because this is my only shot at having children. Now, how would we know? How would we disentangle those possibilities? How would we know how Abraham was really thinking? Well, here's how we find out. Now Abraham has a child. Now, what's his relationship with God? If it was really a relationship, a deep relationship of faith, of trust, maybe even of love, then that relationship should go on untouched. But God is worried that it's going to turn out that Abraham was just using God. Abraham didn't care about God. Abraham just wanted God for the one thing that God could provide that nothing else could provide, and that was a child. And this is a really fascinating emotional insight into God's character here. God is really jealous, not jealous of other gods, but jealous of other affections and affiliations and faiths and trusts among the people with whom God wants to have a relationship. Now, God is always going to have a problem like this because God is the provider. And so there's absolutely no way for someone to have a relationship with God without also turning to God as provider, for provisions. In other words, a couple in love, we're moved by stories where a couple, one lover gives to the other something that is entirely selfless. Or in rabbinic tradition, the story of Rabbi Akiva and his wife, well, I shouldn't say Rabbi, Akiva and his wife, Rachel, who live on straw for years because they have no money. They can't provide each other with anything other than love. And that proves something about the love. It's not utilitarian because there's no utility to it. It's nothing other than love. In human relationships, we do worry about this, right? We do worry that people that we love, that we sincerely care about, are treating us only as utilitarian. And this is, to some extent, the parallel to the distinction that Martin Buber made between an I-it relationship, meaning a person that I'm treating as an it, as someone who's doing something in my life, driving the bus that I'm riding on. They're not a you, they're not a person in 3 dimensions, they're driving the bus. I'll smile and be kind to them, but I don't know anything about them. They're not a deep, rich part of my life. That is a utilitarian relationship, and that is fine. But someone I really care about, I actually worry about whether they treat me reciprocally with care and love, or whether they're treating me as a utilitarian relationship. And that's what Buber talked about as an I-thou or I-you relationship. 2 people really meeting in a deep way. And it turns out that God worries about this as well. God, now that Abraham has a child, God is really paranoid. Is Abraham actually going to trust and love him anymore? And he gets a sign, maybe a hint, that Abraham doesn't care anymore because he turns around and signs away part of the rights of the land. And God says, uh-oh, I might have to take away the child. If I tell you, offer him as a burnt offering, let's see what that pact accomplished, right? Will you still be faithful to me? That's a real trial then. I'm diverging a bit from Rashbam, who doesn't think it's a trial, but that would be a real trial. God says, okay, I'm worried that now that you have a child, our relationship has turned utilitarian. Let's test it. What happens if I ask you to give up that child? Are you still with me? And astonishingly, Abraham is. So these are directions for thought opened up by Rashbam's interpretation. Now we're going to end today with one last interpretation. And this one by a modern thinker, Yeshayahu Leibovich. In North America, he's typically best known as the brother of Nechama Leibovich, who was a great teacher of Bible, of Tanakh in Jerusalem. The two of them, fascinating family, clearly, that they came from, German family, moved to Palestine early in the century. Leibovich was actually a scientist. In Israel, Nechama Leibovich is much less well known, and she's typically known as the sister of Yeshayahu Leibovich. Neither of them married. Both of them did remarkable things with their lives. Now, Leibovich offers the following, and I'm going to warn you that this is a bit philosophically and ethically troubling. Leibovich says, in the middle of this story, after Abraham is willing to offer Isaac as a sacrifice, the angel says, now I know that you fear the Lord. Leibovich says, listen to this. We've been reading about Abraham for 10 chapters. Abraham's done a lot of things until now. God didn't know that until now he feared the Lord. Why not? And Leibovich says, I'll tell you why not. Because Abraham has actually done a few different things that indicated that maybe he didn't quite fear the Lord. For example, when God said he was going to punish the people of Sodom, Abraham got up and argued that God has to be just and righteous. These very rousing lines that we quote all the time. Abraham says, God forbid that the judge of the earth should do anything unjust. And Leibovich says, that was wrong. Abraham was actually wrong in saying that. There is no obligation for God to be just and ethical. There's no such rule. God can do whatever God wants to do. And so from a stance like that, from an argument like that, we actually have no evidence that Abraham feared God. On the contrary, we have evidence that Abraham had an ethical sense and mistakenly imposed it on God, but did not really appreciate how different God was. So let me quote a couple of lines from Leibovich himself. You see here in the Hebrew and the English. The devotees of ethical monotheism, which for Leibovich he's going to disparage this, in their efforts to empty religion of its theocentric belief content and to establish religion as merely anthropocentric morality, endlessly admire Abraham's stance in the argument about Sodom and its righteous people. So, modern people who think that religion ought to be moral, love Abraham at the argument about Sodom. Leibovich says, but God didn't say, now I know that you fear God in that story. Only here. Why only here? I'm going to skip a little bit. Because Abraham didn't treat God as anything other than a human judge. A human judge should act ethically, and God should act ethically. God is basically no different than a ruler of flesh and blood. In this sense, this is anthropomorphism. In other words, Abraham was treating God as a human. And listen to this line, one who worships God for these reasons is actually worshiping himself. Leibovich says that was not real religious worship. When Abraham turned around to God and said, God, you have to act ethically, Abraham was, first of all, making a mistake. God does not have to act ethically. And second of all, showing that he might not really appreciate what God is at all, and in fact just thinks that God is sort of a glorified human being. I need to act ethically, so God should act ethically. All the more so. And for Leibovich, this is a category error, and only at the Akedah. Now along comes the Akedah. Only at the Akedah does God give Abraham a command that's not moral. And for Leibovich, that's the whole point. Abraham is being asked to choose. Are you going to be ethical, or are you going to fear God? You're going to be ethical, or are you going to fear God? That's like a horrible statement to even say, right? But that, for Leibovich, is exactly the point of the Akedah. And when Abraham correctly, in Leibovich's assessment, chose to offer Isaac on the altar, God then says, now I know that you fear God. Now I know that you fear God. If you fear God and that works out well with your own values, with your own ethics, how do I know that you're fearing God? Now I know you fear God because you did something that's counter to everything else good in the world. It's very disturbing, I think, actually. We will spend some more time coming back to this and thinking about other ways of reading the story that don't have to countermand all of our ethical intuitions. But I do want you to sit with Leibovich for a bit and think about how that casts the story in a different light and how it casts religion in a different light. In the last few minutes, we're going to just talk about one other question, and I'm going to zip through a couple of sources and dwell on one last source. And for most readings, other than Rashbam, this is a test. It says so at the beginning, God tested Nisa, Abraham. Now, what's the point of a test? Typically, we give tests for one of two reasons, either for the benefit of the person testing, so let's say a teacher who gives a quiz, just for the benefit of knowing how the class is doing. Did they understand what we did yesterday? Or there could be good tests that are for the benefit of the person being tested, either in the long run or educationally. Right? By taking this test, I'm going to give you thinking questions. You're going to actually have to do them, and it's going to be good for your own learning. How does that work out in the Akedah? Well, most thinkers, most theologians have a hard time saying this is for God's benefit. I actually think that's not an unreasonable thing to say, but most theologians have a hard time with that. God can't be learning anything from the test because God already knows. So then it can't be for the benefit of the person giving the test. Is it for the benefit of Abraham? It seems at least that it's hard to see how that would work. How does Abraham benefit from this? And so some thinkers thought of a third option. And this is most famously and best associated with Maimonides, with the Rambam, that it's not for the person doing the testing or the person being tested, but for the audience. And Maimonides writes that the Akedah actually teaches us two important things. I'm going to dwell on the first one here, although the second one is important for other purposes. First one is to make known to us the limits of the love for God and fear of Him, to what extent they reach. In other words, the story teaches us almost a legal lesson of how far one must go for the love and fear of God. And the answer is all the way. There is nothing, there's no limit to what one ought to do for the love and fear of God. But the important part for us right now is that this is not a lesson for Abraham, and it's not a lesson for God. It's a lesson for us, for the audience of the story, not for the characters in the story. And I should say that some interpreters of Maimonides took this and said, well, in that case, did it even have to happen? After all, if it's not for Abraham and it's not for God, it's really for the audience. Well, we're the audience. We're reading the story. We're not there. In fact, there is no live audience. Abraham is alone on a mountaintop. And so some interpreters of Maimonides said, what Maimonides really means to say is that this happened in a dream, that Abraham and Isaac actually never were on a mountaintop. Abraham just had a dream about this, and it's reported to us as a story to teach us this lesson. I actually don't know if Maimonides meant that or not. Maimonides elsewhere seems to refer to it as a historical event, but it doesn't really matter who thinks that that's true. The important point is that conceptually, that's a fair point. If the target audience of the story, if the target audience of a test is in fact the audience, and the audience can be a literary audience, then in fact, the historical veracity of the story doesn't matter at all. But I want to come back to a different perspective. Nachmanides, Ramban, the 13th century, says, no, it really is for the benefit of Abraham. What does Abraham benefit? And Ramban says, there's a detail in God's judicial system that you need to know here. And that's that no matter how good a person I am, I can't get rewarded for values I hold, only for actions I do. Or at least the reward for actions is greater than the reward for values. And this makes intuitive sense, right? It may turn out that I am the most courageous person in North America right now. However, I've never been granted any sort of medal by the government because I'm sitting here in my basement teaching classes. And so my courage has never been tested. My courage has never been seen. So even if I could prove that I am in my nature a profoundly courageous person, I won't get rewarded for that because I haven't done anything with that courage. And so Abraham, says Nachmanides, would have gotten rewarded for his great faith. But the potential faith that he has, the faith that he has, that gives him the potential of doing things, is not going to give him as much reward as actually acting on that. And so God gave him the command to allow him, and this is a key line, to bring forth the matter from the potential to the actual, or to paraphrase a little bit, to actualize his spiritual potential, so that he may have the reward of a good deed, not of a good thought alone. And so Nachmanides says the point of the test is always for the benefit of the person being tested, and that's simply to give them the chance to live up to their values. It's a really fascinating idea. And our last source for today is a intellectual heir of Nachmanides in the following century, a commentator named Rabbi Nisim of Gerona, abbreviated as Ran. And Nisim of Gerona raises the question, what is this Nisayon? And he sort of quickly summarizes. Maimonides says it's for other people to teach us lessons. Nachmanides says it's for the tested, in order to give the person a chance to actualize their potential. And I say something else. And he says something really powerful, and this is the point that I'll leave you with for this week. He says, it's not only for reward purposes that God wants Abraham, in this case, to have the reward of a good deed, not just for the reward of a good heart. It's that going through a trial actually pushes someone higher and harder than they would have gotten otherwise. Right? And I think we know this intuitively from our own experience as well. It's true in athletics, it's true in writing, it's true in all sorts of contexts, where all the practice in the world is actually never going to be the same as actually doing something under what we call test conditions. Right? Doing it under test conditions is going to raise our stress levels, raise our anxiety levels, and then we'll find out whether we can really succeed. And if we do, we will succeed at a higher level than we would have been able to in practice. And Rabbeinu Nissim says that's the point of trials. The point is not just to give Abraham reward. The point is that Abraham is actually able to accomplish things in a trial that he wasn't able to accomplish beforehand. It's not that he was potentially up to level 10 beforehand, but never put it into practice. It's that beforehand he was only up to level 8 or 9. And now he got a trial at level 10, and so he has to work on himself and raise himself to the next level. And so Ran makes a really interesting general point about this. He says, in general, the Torah doesn't want to challenge us too much. It gives us easy things to do. I don't know if we all experience it the same way he did, but he experienced mitzvot in general as easy. You know, it's supposed to be for everyone. So here's sort of baseline. Everyone do the following. It shouldn't be too difficult, and you'll be great. But unfortunately, as we know with all sorts of things, if you aim for mediocrity, on the one hand, you succeed in lifting up the bottom part, but you never really challenge the top quadrant of your population. And so Rabbeinu Nissim says, well, that's the point of trials in the Torah. God sometimes says, you know what, that person, they can actually do much better than the typical one. Right? So as an educator, you think about this all the time, right? So I have to give assignments and a test that the average person in the class can do reasonably well in. It's not fair to set the bar higher than a reasonably good student can do well in. But then the unfortunate reality is that the extraordinary students are never going to be fully challenged. So Torah says, that's fine. There's something called differentiated education, right? So we have mitzvot for everyone, but then there's sometimes trials for special people. And those people are given incredibly difficult challenges to get them to rise to levels that they otherwise never would have risen to. Now, just to spell this out in the context of Abraham, the rabbinic tradition is that Abraham had 10 trials, beginning perhaps with the command to leave his father's house, according to other traditions, actually began before that, and culminating in the Akedah, culminating in the binding of Isaac. For Rabbeinu Nissim, of course it culminates here. This is the ultimate spiritual accomplishment of Abraham. At this point, he has reached the climax of faith. There is nowhere else to go, And if there were anywhere else to go, Abraham couldn't get there. At this point, God calls off the game because he's pushed him level after level, right? He's like a coach. He says, okay, can you do it? Can you do it a mile in under 4:30? Can you do a mile in under 4:20? Can you do a mile under 4:10? At some point, the coach says, you got it, right? Not because you couldn't keep reducing the time, but because I realized that the runner is not going to be able to go faster. It's fine, we did it. God calls off the trials after the Akedah because Abraham has reached his peak. Now, maybe this is the peak of human experience ever, but it's also Abraham's peak. This is it. The trials pushed Abraham step after step after step to perfect his own spiritual nature. And after the Akedah, he was done. His divine coach said, okay, we're done. Now I know that you fear God, and we'll have to end our trials there. And we will have to end our class here. We have many more topics to pick up on and to study. Next week, we'll start with the question of where is Isaac, which, as we'll see, leads to all sorts of interesting possibilities that were explored by early Christian readers, but also, of course, also as possibilities explored by Jewish readers in terms of thinking about Isaac's role in the story and the question of martyrdom in the story. So that will be our big topic for next class. In the meantime, wish you a very good week. It's been very good to start studying with you. Please do be in touch with any questions or comments about the topic this week and about going forward. My email address, I think, is on the flyer, but just to remind you, it's Koller, Koller, @yu.edu. And I look forward to continuing next week.